What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and welcome back to another epic episode of Bad Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure Decks, the ongoing series where I take a look at the older Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks and analyze them in the context of when they came out and tell you why they were much worse than you may have remembered. Now, the most important part of this series is that I'm analyzing these based on the time period that they were released in. Of course, all of these structure decks from 2006 are not going to stand up against modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, but I am specifically talking about why they were bad when they came out. And today's video is probably the most requested structure deck that I've ever had on every single video. This is like the top comment, and that is structure deck Blaze of Destruction. Man, people really hate this deck, and I can see why. And part of the reason that I can see why is that this was released alongside one of the better structure decks, the Fury from the Deep. Now, Fury from the Deep had a really good cohesive strategy and a ton of great reprints, and actually was a force to be reckoned with, especially on like a casual level. But structure deck Blaze of Destruction is so bad. Now, this is one of the first structure decks ever released. It was actually the third one overall, but back when this structure deck came out, Konami was releasing structure decks in pairs. So the first pair had zombies and dragons, and the second pair had fire and water. This is obviously the fire side, but the difference between the fire and the water one is astronomical. If you and your buddy both bought each one of the structure decks, and your buddy happened to buy the water one, you would likely lose every single game. And that is not an exaggeration. This deck is so much worse than the water one, and today we're going to talk about why. So first of all, I'm going to do something I have never done with bad structure decks, and that is I'm going to show you the boss monster first. And this is good because the boss monster usually tells us what the theme of the structure deck is, but right off the bat here you will see that that's not the case with this one. So Infernal Flame Emperor looks really cool. It's definitely one of my favorite artworks from the structure deck boss monsters. It's a huge monster, kind of, 2,700 attack points. This card cannot be special summon. Now, that was something that they put on a lot of these structure deck boss monsters, so while that is definitely a bad thing, it's not to be unexpected. When this card is tribute summoned, you can remove from play up to 5 fire monsters in your graveyard, destroy a number of spell and trap cards on the field equal to the number of monsters removed from play for this effect. Now, on paper, this might not seem like the worst effect ever, and you know what? It's really not the worst. It's not completely useless, except for the fact that this has nothing to do with the theme of the rest of the deck or the themes that are in this deck. There is a loose theme that ties this with the actual strategy that the fire structure deck is trying to do, but generally speaking, this deck doesn't just blow up back row. It's not the point of it at all. There is sort of a banishing sort of thing going on here. If you take a look at it in a card like Inferno, it also has to banish a fire monster. So there's sort of a loose theme of having fire monsters in the grave to summon fire monsters or use their effects, but that's really not the focus of the deck. And on that note, Inferno is frustratingly bad only because all it would have taken for this card to be really good is for its attack and defense stats to be switched. Giving an 1100 attack monster an ability that only activates when it destroys the monster by battle is a joke. That is completely useless. And while this card is cool, it doesn't actually do anything, but it is cool because it accurately describes both of the actual themes of the structure deck in one single card, that being killing monsters by battle and doing burn damage. Now, there aren't a lot of cards in this deck that actually do both of them, but those are the two major themes here. Now, I can give Konami a pass because these older structure decks don't always have nearly as cohesive of a theme as the newer ones, but that's sort of loosely what we're talking about here. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that unlike a lot of these other structure decks, this one actually had a 3 of in it, and that was UFO Turtle. UFO Turtle, they gave you 3 copies, so if you just bought one structure deck, you had a full playset, and that is very not normal for these structure decks. They almost always cap at just 2 copies per card, and a lot of the times it's only a handful of cards that you actually are given more than one copy of. That means that UFO Turtle is clearly very important to Konami in their eyes in regards to this deck, and it does make sense because a lot of the cards in here can be summoned by UFO Turtle. So let's start talking about not only a card that can be summoned with UFO Turtle, but possibly the best half of the burn side of the deck, and that is Solar Flare Dragon. Now, I've already talked about Solar Flare Dragon 2 other times, talking about cards that dominated old school metagames, especially the casual old school metagames. But this card is probably one of the best cards in the deck, and they did give you 2 copies, so you can do the infamous Solar Flare Dragon loop, where you have 2 copies on the board, and your opponent cannot attack either one, and then during each of the end phases, you're doing each of your end phases, you're doing 500 for each copy, which is then 1,000 damage, so after a couple turns, that can get him down to not very many life points, and that's not the least viable strategy, but this is the best burn card in the deck, and especially in relation to the burn decks that were popular back in the day. This card wasn't like the key player, it was just sort of like an addition to it. On the bad side of the things, you have possibly one of the most annoying burn cards ever, and that is Meteor of Destruction. This card doesn't have a very complicated effect. If your opponent's life points are higher than 3,000, inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent. That's all it does. The problem with this is that it literally punishes you for having your opponent at a low life points, which makes no sense because the whole point of a burn deck is to burn your opponent out of the game. I can see why in the context of when this card was released back in 2000, or when this structure deck was released back in 2005, that this card might have seemed too good if it just did 1,000 damage, but it really wouldn't have been. And the fact that this card, the whole point of a burn deck is to kill your opponent through burn effects, but this card only works in the early game, which is really disappointing because I would not be mocking this card if it just did 1,000 damage, and yet they added this really horrible restriction to it, and now this card was not unique to the structure deck, it's just a badly designed card in general, but it is sort of the focal point of like why this structure deck is bad, and why a lot of these older structure decks are bad, because they give you cards that have needless restrictions on them, even though they wouldn't have been that good without those restrictions in the first place. On the really, really bad side of things, we have Darkroom of Nightmare. This card does 300 more damage to your opponent each time I take damage from a card effect, and this is only good in the exact context of having both Solar Flare Dragons on the field, and even in that context, it's not that good. Having 2 Solar Flare Dragons was often just enough to win the game already. This card is not going to do anything. But the problem with this card is that it doesn't gain you advantage. It doesn't really do that much damage to your opponent, and it's not even a burn card on its own. It requires you to have other cards, and 300 is not enough of a bonus. Even a deck like in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Trick Stars that burns your opponent for thousands of damage every single turn does not play this card. Now, early builds of that deck did sort of test this card, but it turns out that a continuous spell card that only does 300 damage each time you already are doing damage to your opponent is not, in fact, good enough to warrant deck slots, even in a deck where half of the strategy is revolving around burning your opponent. And yes, I realize that burning your opponent is sort of a pun because this is a fire deck, but we're going to ignore that. Anyway, on the other side of things, you have sort of the battle aspect of this deck, and it's really big attack monsters. And the best case scenario is Ultimate Baseball Kid. This card can be brought out straight from the deck with UFO Turtle, and it's probably the best attacker that this deck has access to. It gains 1,000 attack for each face of fire monster on the field except itself, and you can send one other fire monster you control to the graveyard, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. Now, I can say that the second effect is really, really bad because for every monster that you're sending to the graveyard, not only are you losing advantage, but you're also only doing 500 damage, even though this guy is losing 1,000 attack for each one you send. That is not a good strategy unless you barely were able to unless you almost killed your opponent, and then you have to get rid of like your field to do 2,000 damage to finally win the game. But other than that context, this card, you only want to have for the attack stat, not for the burn effect. And this card is sort of even though it's like the best attacker, you can also see that it's only good if you have 2 other fire monsters on the board, which isn't impossible to do, but it's not probable even when this deck came out. The best case scenario really is that you UFO Turtle into Solar Flare Dragon, and then you normal summon this card, and it's at 1500. Your opponent manages to not kill both this card and the Solar Flare Dragon. Next turn, you summon another Pyro Monster, or another Fire Monster, I should say, and then it goes up to 2500. You burn your opponent for Solar Flare Dragon. You have the 1500 attack from the Solar Flare Dragon. That's sort of like the best line to play, but that's assuming your opponent has 0 removal, which even when this card came out was pretty unlikely. But this is the best attacker in the deck, at least in my personal opinion. Other things that sort of give you incentives to attack your opponent is like the field spell Molten Destruction. There's 2 copies of this in the structure deck. It's not even that bad a card. It gives your guys 500 attack. Yes, it doesn't really like accomplish anything, but that 500 attack does sort of make a difference in the long run. On the bad side of things, we have Little Chimera, which is I mean, it's a normal summon version of the field spell, but it only has 1100 attack, even with its own boost, so that doesn't really make a huge difference. Just cut this card completely if you're looking to play some old school Yu-Gi-Oh! With fire decks. Just play 3 copies of Molten Destruction. It's just infinitely better. Even acknowledging that you can have multiple Little Chimeras on the board, and that sort of gives you a much bigger boost, that is just not worth the downside of this card being really bad by itself. And the last thing that I want to mention with attacking is the card that is so bad, and that is Gaia Soul, the Combustible Collective. Now, this is one of the grossest looking cards I've ever seen. Please do not stare into its eye. It does not like that. You'll make it angry. Once per turn, you contribute up to 2 Pyro-type monsters. This card gains 1000 attack for each. If this card attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. During the end phase, destroy this card. Now, that during the end phase, destroy this card is not a condition of using the tributing effect. It just always happens. So the main plan with this card is to summon it, do 2000 damage to your opponent, and then that's it. In that regard, it's at least marginally better than a card like Meteor of Destruction, if we ignore the fact that if your opponent has a monster, this thing won't actually get in 2000 damage. But the tribute effect is so bad. Do not tribute cards for this. That is not tributing. Losing 3 cards to do 4000 damage if your opponent has an open board is almost never worth it, considering that the only way that this could ever be worth it is if the cards you're tributing have less than 1000 attack, because that's all that you're getting from tributing them. It's very similar to Ultimate Baseball Kid. Why are you losing 1000 attack only to do 500 damage? And in the case of Gaia Soul, it's not even direct damage, it's just increasing its own attack, which means that in almost every scenario, you're normal summoning this, you're doing some damage, or you're crashing into another monster, and then it blows up in the end phase, which does not support the sort of theme of this deck, which is going to be having monsters on the board so that you can actually build up the attack points of Ultimate Baseball Kid. This thing should not self-destruct. I mean, obviously when it came out, it would have been too good if it just didn't ever self-destruct. But I think the self-destruct effect should really only happen if you choose to use a tributing effect. And even then, I don't think it would be that good. Not nearly as consistent as Ultimate Baseball Kid in terms of snowballing your opponent out of the game, but at least slightly playable. Anyway, though, that is going to wrap up this bad structure deck review. I think I'm going to maybe experiment with doing a couple good structure deck reviews. I don't know if you guys would be interested in that. Maybe it's more entertaining hearing me complain about these decks. But this fire deck, man, it's just not good. And it's not nearly as good as the water one. I think if I do the good structure deck review, I'm going to review the water one first, just so we can compare the power levels of 2 structure decks that came out at the exact same time, but that are very different in terms of viability. Anyway, let me know which ones you guys want to see in the next episodes of bad or good structure deck reviews, and I will see you guys later. Bye.